Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's event. I still see quite a few people joining in, so we're going to just give it about 2 more minutes and go ahead and get started. Thank you for your patience. Okay, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the first of 5 action-packed events in the Let's Do It in the Cloud webinar series. Every Thursday at 1 p.m. East Coast for the next 5 weeks, guest presenters from Agilist Solutions, Dell Boomi, IDC, SafeNet, Think Strategies, and Zuora will walk you through tips, tricks, and best practices for conquering some of the most challenging obstacles associated with cloud service delivery, from service deployment and integration to best practices for service pricing, packaging, and usage control, to service lifecycle management from trial to upsell and beyond. My name is Michelle Nerlinger, and I'll be your moderator for this series. Today, we're very excited to have Amy Connery, Research VP of Software Licensing and Provisioning from IDC, joining us. Having just wrapped up her latest research project, As Cloud Applications Mature, So Do Monetization Models, Amy will be walking us through the current status of SaaS adoption in the software industry and what software publishers such as yourselves need to plan for, operationally, technologically, and business model-wise when it comes to achieving profitability in the cloud. At the end of the presentation, Amy will be joined by Jake Fox, Head of New Product Development and Management for SafeNet. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that questions can be submitted at any time during the live webcast. Simply click the questions button on your screen and enter your question. We will answer the questions at the end of the webcast during the dedicated Q&A time. Amy and Jake will both have full visibility to the questions coming in throughout the course of the webinar, so we do encourage you to use this feature to not only ask questions, but to share your experiences to help guide the direction of the dialogue. Finally, for those of you social media users on the line, we encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter. Please use the hashtag LDIITC, short for Let's Do It in the Cloud, so we can address your questions and comments real-time throughout the event. Now, without any further ado, let's get started. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, everybody, for joining this afternoon or this morning. I really appreciate it and look forward to having a conversation with you about this exciting topic. A little bit of an introduction to you on who I am. I've been with IDC for a little over a decade, and pretty much that entire time I've been looking at delivery models and for software and essentially how software business models are changing. I started off as one of the first analysts in our ASP program, Application Service Provisioning, for those of you that don't recall that. That was the hosting of applications, which was the new thing at the time. Around the 1999-2000 time frame, we also saw an emerging type of software company that wasn't just hosting an traditional enterprise application, but in fact was offering a new type of application. We called them web native at the time as a service, and of course that's evolved into the SaaS space and also the cloud services space as we know it. And at the same time, I've also been looking very closely at monetization models for software. And I've worked with many, many companies over the years at all stages of software as a service, and what I mean by that are companies that are basically launching from the ground up with a software as a service or cloud services offering, companies that have had primarily on-premise software businesses with traditional perpetual licensing that they are transitioning to SaaS, or they've acquired SaaS capabilities and now have kind of a hybrid go-to-market model. And the other role that I have at IDC is responsible for looking at the big picture software revenue forecasts and software industry megatrends. So, essentially what's going on in the industry worldwide. We look at IDC at about 82 different functional software markets, and a functional market would be something like email or supply chain management or customer relationship management. And I look across all of the markets and understand how is software being monetized, what are some of the different ways that companies are getting access to this type of functionality. And obviously, over the last 10 or 13 years that I've been with IDC, a lot of really, really interesting changes have happened in the software industry. And so it's been very exciting to be a part of that. And it's also really exciting to look forward, which is really what the bulk of this presentation does, and think about how the software industry has changed and, more importantly, how it will change now that a lot of these applications that were launched in the 1999-2000 timeframe with these cutting-edge business models at the time are becoming much more mainstream. There, certainly begs the question of what next, and maybe as the business matures, as the cloud services business matures, as the SaaS applications mature themselves, what does that mean for monetization models and how those might need to change in addition? Because a lot of these, I found a lot of the SaaS companies that I've worked with over the years have gone through many, many changes and many iterations themselves as a business, and as the value that they provide to customers changes as they grow their customer base and get to understand their customer base better over several years' time. So it's a great opportunity, I think, now to really look at what the industry needs to do to prepare itself going forward. Now, before I get too far down the road talking about cloud, one of the things that I have always had to do, I guess, in my 13-year history with IDC is start out with a definition slide. The reason for that is that I found that when ASP was a hot term, as an example, many years ago, there were many companies that wanted to be associated with that term, and there was some flexible use of the definition, I guess, of ASP, and it caused a lot of confusion in the marketplace, and I think we've seen similar confusion around cloud. And so whenever I start to talk about, I don't like to just generally say cloud this and cloud that without first clarifying a bit what I mean by cloud. I expect that most of you folks on the phone already know a lot about this, but again, I like to cover my bases and make sure that we're all on the same page. I've mentioned cloud and software as a service interchangeably as I've spoken my introductory slide. And the reason for that are essentially public cloud services on the far right here. These are the services that we are very well familiar with: NetSuite, Salesforce.com, WebEx, BrightTalk that we're using today. These are services that are designed for one-to-many provisioning access out to customers. Multiple enterprises share access to it, and really public cloud services and software as a service applications are the same thing. There are some, you can get into nitty-gritty. Well, not all software as a service applications have utility type pay as you use or usage-based pricing meters, but a lot of the applications that are public cloud services and are strongly identified with them today don't either. We'll get into that, but I think public cloud services are very well known and understood. Private cloud services are essentially customers, enterprises building a cloud environment on-premise and putting applications in that optimized cloud environment. So traditional on-premise applications, but in a cloud environment, and that means lots of virtualization, lots of optimization there, very dynamic environment, and also support for chargebacks. And the hybrid in the middle, that's going to be the reality in most enterprises. A little bit of this, a little bit of that. We're still early on in the development of private cloud, and I've talked to many, many CIOs, and they're really just, in terms of the software applications that are being placed in the private cloud, really kind of getting just the tip of the iceberg there. But we expect to see a lot more happening on that front, and certainly this hybrid scenario is going to dominate, because that's, the reality in a lot of organizations is that there are certain needs that may be met by public cloud services and other needs that might be better met by on-premise applications either in the public cloud or in many cases not in the public cloud. Not in the private cloud, rather. The presentation that I'm going to be giving here from here on is really going to focus on public cloud services. That's the research that I have done on looking at cloud services monetization really focuses on that. One of the reasons is that in the private cloud space, where you've got on-premise applications, many of them are licensed traditionally. There needs to be a lot of change in order to make software more friendly for deployment in private cloud, but that's in many cases a separate discussion from what do we need to do in the public cloud services space and the software as a service space to make things more sophisticated and better proxies for value. One of the things that I want to also lay out for you in a visual sense is how much the IT environment is really changing and what's driving that change. If you've gone to any big industry conference, and this is conference season, so it seems like every ISV out there, and Dell just had their conference, everyone in the technology industry has their big conference where they talk about big picture items going forward. And business demand drivers across the top here, you're going to hear these mentioned in every single conference. I think the one that's missing here that I do hear a lot about as well is social. That doesn't play a huge role in this presentation, but it's certainly a demand driver in terms of innovation, as an example. IT consumerization, mobility, big driver, looking for sources of new revenue, very competitive environment for a lot of businesses, and then cost optimization. So we see, IDC sees from our surveys that business demand for IT services really growing. And at the same time, IT budgets are either decreasing or flat. And I think that as we get a better sense of what's going to happen in the economy, we'll be looking at that to see whether we are flat or decreasing in the foreseeable future. But I think it's easy to say pretty authoritatively that they're not going to grow anytime soon, at least even in response to this business demand for IT services. And then the third factor that you have to keep into account is that the IT service supply, which is basically the number of people in IT services, is decreasing. So you've got less people in IT budgets not growing, and the demand for IT services because of all of these demand drivers growing quite rapidly. So really, where does private cloud and public cloud play a role? Well, it has to play a role in meeting these gaps. So, if you're an ISV that does not have a cloud strategy, one of the challenges you're going to run into is that the demand for your application as an on-premise licensed perpetually model is going to decrease as companies look to essentially do more with less, optimize the spend that they have. And we really hear from CIOs that that's going to be accomplished by the consumption of public cloud services as well as the expansion of private cloud initiatives. Some additional cloud data, one of the main points of this presentation was to talk a bit about adoption of cloud, and so hopefully this gives you a good sense of what we are hearing from various folks. There's a lot of different data points here. I'm just going to point out a few. Like I said, I've been covering this space for a long time, and we've done surveys for a long time. And, now the majority of NA, that's North America companies, using some sort of public cloud service. That certainly doesn't surprise me. It might even be a little bit higher because there are some services that are so ubiquitous, we don't necessarily think of them coming from the cloud. And I think web conferencing is an example of one that a lot of businesses use. And it's just so ubiquitous that it's just not always considered a public cloud service. Some people, of course, run that capability on-premise in many cases, but there are other services as well that people have become very used to using in the enterprise, and they probably don't even really think of them as cloud. Most companies expect their cloud spend to increase by about 20%. We've seen that historically, and one of the things that we saw during the last downtick in the economy, 2008 to 2009 timeframe, was that there was a lot of shifting toward cloud at that time, or an acceleration of shift toward cloud to get access to applications functionality in a time when budgets were very, very tight. And what cloud services and the monetization models, or the spending models from the customer perspective, allow you to do is really to spread payments over time, to tap operating budgets, all things that you folks on the line probably already recognize, but I think it's important to keep that in mind as we think about what's going to be happening in the economy going forward. And I know we at IDC think a lot about that, and we already think that from what we hear from customers that they plan on increasing their cloud spend, and how much will the economy accelerate that as well. The other thing that's really a data point I want to point out in it looks maroon on my screen, the box that's more of a horizontal orientation. 82% of net new commercial apps will be developed for the cloud in 2012. So that is a really important number. If you're not thinking about cloud deployment for your application from the get-go, then that really does not make sense in the context of what we're hearing from the demand side. Really, it's either a public cloud or a private cloud. That's where customers are looking to put these applications, and what's holding them back, a whole series of things. Whether in many cases. We have survey data that 38% of customers, and I actually will show that a little bit later, think that it's the actual models, the payment models themselves that have made cloud difficult for them to adopt beyond what they are adopting today. And there are also some issues as well, concerns around security and privacy, which have been there since the dawn of cloud. I think there's some good arguments why those shouldn't be concerns, but in many cases it just takes time to get over that. That type of thinking. And then the last point, greater than 80% of Global 2000 will still have IT on site in 2020. So we see all this movement to cloud, and I am very grounded in this fact, as well should you. This hybrid, the idea of a hybrid environment will dominate. While public cloud services are playing a much greater role than they have in the past, where they are becoming more sophisticated and will need to have more sophisticated monetization models, they will coexist with on-premise applications for the foreseeable future, for sure. So something that's really important to take into account. And the last piece of data on this graph that I just want to highlight for you is these blue graphs here, which is from our 2011 cloud survey. Essentially, why are customers adopting cloud? Business agility, scalability, and cost flexibility. So cost is important, and the question here was the primary reason. But really, it's from those business drivers in the very beginning, innovate, be more competitive. All of those things are really driving companies' moves toward cloud and toward cloud services. And so something, again, exciting to be a part of, but you need to be a part of it if you want to be a part of the IT industry, through 2020, essentially, going forward. So what does IDC think will be big cloud events to watch for in 2012? A big year for private cloud services adoption and deployment. As I mentioned earlier, really just the tip of the iceberg, what we've seen so far. We also have started to see the next gen of on-premise enterprise software designed for the cloud to roll up. What does that mean in the context of public cloud services? I think one of the things that it can be very exciting is the opportunity to integrate public cloud services into applications that customers maybe would want to keep on-premise for whatever reason, but having them being able to coexist in a better way with public cloud services makes it much more viable to adopt public cloud services, makes it much more cost-effective from an integration perspective. Public cloud services adoption growing at over 5 times the rate of overall IT spending. Very, very rapid, and in part because we're starting from a smaller base than overall IT spending, so you see higher growth rates there. But we are, certainly this is an opportunity in a market size that's been in existence. We've been tracking at least for a decade, so it's not a completely new entrant on the scene. And with 80% of companies launching new applications in the foreseeable future, embodying this type of a model, it's no surprise that this is something that will continue to grow rapidly. And then I really think, and this transitions us to the remainder of the presentation here, that monetization models for cloud services will move to the forefront. And that's really the key of the crux of this presentation. And, something that's been around for 10 years, you would expect to see some changes in sophistication of the business models, and that's really what we're seeing as well. So one of the things that I talk a lot about when I'm, at any of these big industry conferences where folks are talking about these pillars of differentiation. We're going to differentiate our software products by having mobile capabilities or launching a mobile application that's complementary with our core application, having an analytics and big data play, and a cloud services play, and increasingly we hear a social enterprise play. Underlying all of this is licensing, and it's one of those topics that doesn't tend to move to the forefront too much in big industry conferences, but it's really, really important for companies to think about, not just in the back of their minds, but intertwined with their strategy for what do I want to do with mobile? How do customers value mobile? How do customers value the ability to get access to this functionality as a cloud service? And do they value it in different ways than they would value an on-premise application? And the licensing component is something also that's been very closely associated with on-premise applications. But in fact, if you go to most of the leading software as a service, cloud services applications vendors today, you will find people within that organization that have licensing in their title. They have end-user licensing agreements. I had to tick one off in order to, not tick one off in terms of make one upset, but click the box of a end-user licensing agreement before I was able to join this web conference. Licensing exists and really in these software as a service applications to enable monetization, to protect IP the same way that it does in on-premise applications. But notice how I'm talking about enable here. I really think that licensing has gotten a bad rap, and in many cases it is warranted with on-premise legacy perpetual licensed applications, and that it's not enabling anything good. It tends to be a barrier to good experiences, at least from what you hear from the bulk of people when you talk about licensing. When I tell people that's what I look at, the general reaction is always, I hate that stuff, or something a little bit not even as nice as that. But it really can be an enabler, anytime, anywhere access, and better connection between experiences, value, and pricing. And I'm not just being naive about that. I've seen it work in practice. It's not easy to do, but it can happen. Now, I already quoted this 38% of our cloud survey respondents saying that current software license agreements are the primary obstacles to greater cloud use. If this webinar allowed me to do bills, I might do these individually, so I apologize that there's a lot on this slide. But some of the problems with perpetual on-premise and the way that I've kind of drawn this, hopefully you kind of get this very simple graphic. Revenue over time with perpetual on-premise software, a lot of revenue dwindling down to not a lot of revenue over time. So you've got that big perpetual upfront deal, and there are some bullets here on why licensing policy does not work well in the cloud, particularly private cloud. The subscription/cloud model has always been the anti-legacy, anti-traditional software business model. However, we see a lot of the same challenges in licensing as with subscription and cloud as we see in perpetual on-premise. As an example, and in many cases because they're designed for the Wildfire Phase, which I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide, but it's the same exact metrics that you see with on-premise. I remember when I first started covering this space, that was a key question. Okay, so how are they pricing this? How's the subscription model? What metrics are they using? Well, it's pretty much the exact same metrics that you would see with an on-premise CRM application or, any type of an application on-premise. It's typically per user per month. Also, no or very rudimentary controls. When you've got an application, I talked to one company that their first model was an unlimited model, essentially. You get unlimited access to it. There's no controls built into that type of a model because why would you need it? We're going to give customers unlimited access. There'll be a price associated with that. But we want a lot of people to adopt, so we're not going to put barriers in place. And one of the things that we've found is that the initial metric, the metric that you thought of in 1999 or 2002 or 2003, you've got a lot of experience since then. The application has changed a ton. You've done quarterly releases. Your customers have changed. They used to look like this. Now they're global. Now they're enterprise level. The initial metric might no longer work, but you might find that it's not as easy as just snapping your fingers and saying, well, I think I'm going to change pricing and have it work this way. And we'll get into a little bit of why. If you think of, I mentioned the wildfire phase, you can kind of simply think of two different phases in the life of SaaS monetization model sophistication. And I've heard a couple people describe this to me as the Wild West phase, so that's why I've got this Buffalo Bills Wild West picture. And someone else said, you know, it's essentially land and expand. And if you think back to the slide that I presented with the pyramids on it, the subscription model, you know, you start off slow, you want to get in there, and you want to grow over time. And that's because SaaS companies need to ramp up and increase monthly recurring revenue very quickly. And so they achieve this by signing subscribers as rapidly as possible. Also, the business model itself is intentionally vanilla in the wildfire phase. You want to have simplicity because you don't want to have barriers to adoption. I don't understand that pricing model, or I've never seen that metric before, or I've never used this service before, so how do I know what would be the right, you know, just sign up a few users. I don't know if I'd really want to pick the number of projects that I do because I don't know how many projects I'm going to do. So you really wanted to make it simple early on. For the most part, per user per month. I went back and was looking at some profiles work that I'd done in 2005, 2006, 2007, where we go through the business models of various software as a service players, and very, very little exception per user per month. And where you've seen some variation in that model, it's not that the metric has changed, it's that, well, we can do a 1-year deal or a 3-year deal or a 5-year deal, or, you know, we've seen a few other models where there's site licenses or starting to get into enterprise licenses, but the idea of per user per month has not really changed. And you know, other than password authentication will give you a login, there really hasn't been any other type of control because the applications were conceived with the idea that this is a per user per month type of a play, and we just want to get this out there and start signing people up for it. One of the things that we found from talking to companies that have matured and have reached, let's call it the maturity phase, is that the per user per month model may become outdated. And I'm quoting here a VP of Global Sales Operations at a very large software as a service firm, in fact, the largest software as a service firm that is out there. I didn't get a chance to run this quote by her, but it was at a public event, so I think it's pretty legit that it's out here, but that's why I didn't name the firm. And I've heard this from other companies as well. One of the things that may happen is merger and acquisition activity, which is really, really common, may introduce new ways of monetizing software as a service. So you might acquire someone that does something different, and they may have a business model that's a little bit different from yours. Or you may have a situation where management identifies additional ways to turn the value of the service into revenue other than the original business model, or the original business model might not be the right one. So you've got a lot of folks that are looking to optimize the price-value relationship. And there are two things that have to be done. There's way more than two things, but to generalize, in order to do this. On the one hand, you have to figure out what are the best metrics and what are the best policies for that. So that's maybe the monetization policy. The second part is operationalizing that. How do we make sure that that's automated? You know, we're talking about businesses that have to run in cloud time, instantaneous. The perpetual on-premise business, you've got some sort of an operation system that requires some manual process before the customer gets access to the software, or maybe some manual tracking in order to figure out what the software customer owes. While that is not desired, it's certainly not a game stopper. But in the case of the cloud space, if you don't have automation, if you don't have tracking and reporting on a metric that you're going to be pricing based on, if your customer doesn't have visibility into that in real time, that is going to be a game stopper right there. So having both of those elements are really critical. And you know, we've talked to companies that get the first one down, but then realize in order to make that work, and then thinking about all the other things that have become complex over the last decade of software as a service, channel relationships, portals, all of the things that have to work on the operations side, they run into a situation where the complexity of operationalizing it really just kind of collapses the whole thing. I want to give you a few examples because I've talked about these maturing business models and SaaS, and give you some real-world examples of what we've seen beyond the per user per month approach, and just kind of three different elements. There are certainly whole sessions that you could attend, and we've done work as well looking at just this slide and blowing it out for what might work best in your business. But these are just some general categories and companies that have adopted it. So one of the things that you might find as you sell into larger organizations is that larger organizations tend to like enterprise licensing, enterprise license agreements for a few different reasons. Salesforce.com at their Dreamforce conference, in the keynote, very exciting to hear licensing in a keynote of a presentation, doesn't happen that often, but Mark Benioff talked about their social enterprise license agreement, and the first customer for that was Coca-Cola. And essentially, I'm assuming most folks on the phone have heard of an ELA. You would license for unlimited use bounded by the size of your enterprise, essentially. And Coca-Cola basically said to Salesforce, we don't want to pay per user per month for what we're committing to you, which is basically an enterprise play. We want you to help us transform Coca-Cola into a social enterprise. Per user per month doesn't work well for that approach. And per user per month is not great pricing for social software for a variety of reasons. So, Salesforce chose to have this enterprise license agreement. Customers, generally large ones, like that. It takes away nickel and diming. It takes away some of the tracking element, the onus behind the tracking element. You usually get a pretty decent sized discount for doing that. So that might be one thing that you're looking at. Now, that does not really require a lot of it doesn't really need to be operationalized the way that something that's tracking something more granular would be. Is you basically need to turn on access to the entire organization. So you don't necessarily need to change your metric to offer an ELA or a site license as an example. But what you probably do need to look at is your policy behind pricing and discounting, and working with partners as well, and figuring out who sells the ELA and when is it appropriate and when is it not appropriate. Another type of pricing here, usage, not user-based pricing. A lot of companies will say we do usage-based pricing, and when you ask what it is, it's per user per month. Well, that's users, number of users, 10 users, great, but how much are those 10 users using the application? Usage-based pricing. Now, that is going to be something that's going to really vary by what the application does. I gave an example of CenterCode here. CenterCode is a company that I profiled in the cloud report that Michelle had mentioned. They had unlimited pricing early on. They had some role-based pricing, and then ultimately, over the course of time, and the CEO of CenterCode made a joke that they've changed pricing models almost, they've spent almost as much time on pricing as they have on developing the product. It was a little bit of hyperbole there, but he was acknowledging the fact that it does take a lot of time and thought to get this right, and you might make some missteps. And they ultimately arrived on number of beta tests performed. They are an application that facilitates beta testing for technology organizations, all the way from kind of the conception to rollout to feedback. So it's a soup to nuts beta testing application, and something that they felt that was not really the best pricing, was looking at that number of beta tests performed. Qualys is someone that's in the security space. They have kind of a price per transaction application. So price per scan, there's a bundle for a certain number of scans, the cell phone plan essentially, and then each additional scan a la carte. This is for their consulting edition. So you'll see some transaction-based pricing that fits into this usage category, and it is going to vary according to what the software does. And I cannot stress enough how important it is to be able to track this stuff, because the customers are going to want to know what they need to pay, and you're going to want to be able to audit that to a degree as well. And that is not generally inherent in the platform. A lot of times people assume that because it's software as a service and you're managing it centrally, that you're tracking all of this. That's just inherent in the platform. It's automatic. You just kind of go in and cut and paste something, and all of a sudden you can do that. That's not how it works. And these things that are built from the ground up not to track these, it's not a small feat to start to do this metering and tracking. Outcomes-based type pricing is another, or business value pricing, sometimes you hear. Another type of pricing model that we see, Radian6, which is acquired by Salesforce.com last spring, they have a pricing model that's based on essentially the liveliness of online discussions. If you're in the social software space, you probably get that. If you're not, it might not make a lot of sense. But there are different metrics that they tracked based on how much conversation, how much buzz you get around topics that you put out there on social networks, and pricing is based on that, essentially. They help you get buzz, and they also do some analytics to help you measure that, and that's what their pricing is based on, and in my report, I talk a little bit about the challenge that Salesforce.com had when they acquired Radian6 because of the fact that their underlying platform didn't inherently track that, and they had to think about whether they wanted to build that capability. And then Accept 360, they're a company that's looking in the future at how to make, how to measure the way that they help customers save money and make better spending decisions with their R&D dollars. So something that's very outcomes-based, very business value-based, and tracking that, determining that metric is one thing, and then tracking that and operationalizing that is another thing entirely. So I've talked about the technologies. This is a very simple Venn diagram to illustrate some of the players, at least as I see it in monetization. There are probably some others as well, but I think that it's not oversimplifying too much to say there are three main components. The first is platform as a service, which you think of as the underlying platform that you've developed your application on. A lot of these platform as a services out there have the capability to allow you to license per user per month, as an example. So authentication capabilities, they have the capability for you to turn on unlimited access to an application, as an example. But they may not have some of the capabilities that you need in billing, as an example. So the Radian6 Salesforce.com example that I gave, Radian6 had used Zuora prior to the acquisition, and what Salesforce found was that the Force.com platform didn't support the Radian6 business model, so they had to decide, do we want to build this capability or do we continue to use Zuora in our environment for Radian6? And they decided to continue to do that. And then the other component as well is license and entitlement management. And SafeNet, of course, is a company that's involved in this webinar, and a company that's worked with several customers in the cloud ISV space to help them bridge the gap, really, between the capabilities that they have during the Wildfire Phase and the capabilities that they need to get into the maturity phase. So I'm going to transition the discussion over to Jake Fox over at SafeNet to talk a little bit more specifically about that component.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, great coverage on really how things are transitioning. So licensing for the cloud has been something that we've been focused on for 3 years now, really driven by some of our leading customers who are pushing in this direction. So our Sentinel Cloud offering, which we launched earlier this year, really addresses those top challenges for cloud service delivery, and kind of consistent with what Amy's covered throughout, especially in that kind of early adoption and wildfire period. Some of the feedback that we've gotten, and which our service is really built around, is around these bullets here. So how to enforce service agreements, especially when you've launched without any controls in place, product versatility, and business agility, really being able to flexibly repackage, rebundle, split up, and offer new license models to the business without having to get caught up into a new engineering phase. And then sophistication in the license models, definitely something that in the early days, per user per month is maybe enough, but for some businesses that doesn't make sense at all, and in other cases it really leaves a lot of money on the table. So usage models, layered models, a bunch of different ways to really optimize is what we've been hearing from our customers. And then usage or business intelligence, really having that data to drive the business, both from license model standpoint, but also just for simple things like what features are my customers using so I can figure out my roadmap. Or maybe there's a training or adoption issue that, since it's a service, if I don't focus on how my customers are taking up my investments, then I may be missing out on that recurring revenue, and my churn may be increasing. So really some important things to consider from in the service-based model. And then the whole back office piece. So especially from a cloud standpoint, and even coupling it when you have an existing on-premise business, you need to figure out how to tie all this into just the general day-to-day entitlement management, integration with your front office from a sales, order entry, back to your ERP system. And Sentinel Cloud definitely fills that role as well. Moving on to the next slide. This is just a one-slide pitch on what Sentinel Cloud does, and we focus in these 5 areas, solving those problem statements that I mentioned just previously. We focus on helping you manage your product catalog and how you define license models associated to those services. Well, we provide the ability to automatically provision new entitlements and the agreements that you make with your customers so that their rights are provisioned out into your service. And then while your customers are using the service, we provide the user authorization to enable that compliance, to essentially control them within the use of those rights. And then within that scope, we are also collecting usage information associated to how they're using the application at the level you're monetizing it. So it really ties the usage measurement to your license models, which then allows you to drive usage-based billing models. It allows you to understand how your customers are using your application relative to how you monetize. And then lastly, we follow a methodology that really decouples the engineering cycle from the business cycle so that you have flexibility outside of your traditional product life cycle. So you don't have to wait for the next release to offer a new business model. So I'm going to transition this back to Amy so she can kind of cover some summary points.
Great. Thanks, Jake. And I had a chance to just peek at the questions that have already come in while Jake was talking, and I just want to address a couple of them that are pretty quick housekeeping. The slides will be available after the session. And second of all, the question was whether NetSuite would be considered a platform as a service, and yes, they would be, and in fact, I did profile them in my report as well. So just a couple quick things that were easy to answer. So this is a wrap-up slide before we get into the Q&A time. And essentially, a few things to close out the session. Cloud is maturing towards mainstream needs. I think that's clear with a lot of the data that we showed, as well as the fact that this is something that has been around for a long time. We know that cloud applications go through quite rapid evolution, and the customer feedback, the customer feedback element and the way that customers can help drive applications in the directions that they need them to go is just been very dramatic. And so we've seen really exciting evolution of applications from a technology perspective over time. Really, this cross-firewall hybrid private cloud will prevail. So, the mix of public cloud services, applications deployed on-premise that are in a cloud environment, applications deployed on-premise that are not in a cloud environment, all of these things will coexist for some time. And so, for anybody that plays a role in either place, it's really figuring out how can I make it easier for customers to manage my play. My monetization model looks like this. I can't expect that customers are going to be able to manage metering and tracking on their own. I need to make it easy for them to integrate what I have into their environment. The other thing that's been interesting to watch, so interesting, the familiar roles are continuing to change. So, companies that, Amazon is one that continues to blow my mind, having, been an Amazon customer for a really long time. An online bookstore is the dominant infrastructure as a software, infrastructure as a service software application out there. really, it just, you think about it, and would you have ever thought that would have occurred? And there's going to be more of that, and really the how you adapt to the new normal essentially is something that's going to be really important. And understanding that underlying business models and monetization models will need to change along with that. As cloud matures, these monetization models will mature. The per user per month approach may not meet your needs. It may not meet your customer needs. Optimizing the price value equations should be a focus. Certainly easier said than done. There's a lot of guidance out there to try to help you approach that equation, and I guess my advice in this presentation is primarily don't approach that equation without thinking, how will I operationalize that? Do I have the capability to operationalize that? And recognizing that it has to be automated. It can't be manual. This is real-time, cloud-time stuff. You've got to be able to convert trials over. You've got to be able to auto-convert and get people very quickly through the funnel. Those types of things have to happen, and they're not easy to operationalize. And then the last piece is this balancing flexibility and simplicity. So I've talked a lot about how per user per month may not meet the needs. The only thing that per user per month has going for it, not the only thing, but one of the things it has going for it is it's simple. It's easy to understand, even if it isn't the best way of managing value. Okay, I know how many users I have. That's how many passwords authentications I have. Great. When you start to get beyond that, you really have to start thinking about, I'm being more flexible, I'm better aligning this price value equation, but at what point does it become diminishing returns because it's just so complex? People can't get their heads around it. Even if you've got automation in play, it just can't figure out what does this mean for how much I'm going to pay, how is this going to change as my use of this application changes. So you can't have complexity. Remembering that the reason for the existence of the cloud space, in many ways, you have to hand it back to legacy software and the things that are wrong with legacy on-premise software. And one of the things that's wrong with legacy on-premise software is the complex pricing model. So if you're the no software or the anti-software company, you have to make sure that your software licensing models, because you'll have them, are not so complex that people can't deal with them. And so technology plays a role in some of that for sure. And you probably need to make some updates to your underlying technology if you're going to start to be more flexible and price things in different ways. And the other thing is to really look toward the future. I mentioned Centricode that's had 3 different ways that they've priced their product in the life of their company, which is a lot. And they didn't necessarily think about that when they first went to market with their offering, that they were ultimately going to end up pricing it a certain way. So they didn't have any tracking mechanism. So they had to go back when they figured out what the right model was and put that tracking in place. Wouldn't it be great if you could think proactively about, let's build an operational environment that allows me to do a lot of things, to be flexible. So if my competitor or my customer dictates that this is the way that I should price, or my own feeling on the way that value looks in the price value equation, that I have the flexibility to do that because my underlying infrastructure will allow that to happen. So that's really the key there. So the final slide here, I've got my contact information. Of course, I'm on Twitter, as Michelle mentioned. There are also several blogs that I posted. I don't know that you can link to them. The hyperlinks don't show up on the Bright Link page here, but if you have a copy of the presentation, you'll be able to link to these blogs, all on this topic essentially, and other relevant topics. And thank you for your time, and we've left some time for a Q&A if there's anyone that has any questions.
Great, thanks, Amy. As Amy mentioned, we'll now open the floor to our audience to address everyone's questions. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask our presenters a question, please click the questions button on your screen or tweet questions using the Let's Do It in the Cloud hashtag LDIITCnow. The first question goes to Amy. Amy, when you say public cloud growth and adoption, is that more heavily weighted towards consumer usage or B2B usage?
in our data, it's really a mix. We spend a lot of time looking at the B2B enterprise space at IDC, mainly because of the way that our 82 markets break out. They happen to be heavily weighted toward B2B applications. But, clearly on the consumer side, there is a lot of cloud applications out there. I mean, we can probably all think of cloud applications that we use every day in our consumer lives. And in fact, it's that consumer experience, bringing that experience with cloud applications at home, or whether it be with our mobile devices or our at-home devices, laptop-type devices, bringing those experiences to work that's driving a lot of the cloud adoption. I want easy access to applications functionality. I want to pay via subscription. I want there to be a transparent pricing model. I want to have that same experience that I'm having in my consumer life in my business life. So the forecast that we have for cloud is both, essentially. It's all software, and IDC mixes consumer and business software together. If you have a desire to see forecasts broken out differently from that, that's something that we can certainly do, and you can send me a message and I could work out how to do that for you.
Great, thanks. I think the next question is also for you, Amy. Based on the conversations you've had with your clients, what would you say the biggest or most common "I should have done X differently" comment is, and what's that X?
I think that it's figuring out, early on in those Wild West days, I mean, it's so exciting to get that monthly recurring revenue number up. And that's really the goal. Like, let's build that subscriber base up. Let's build that subscriber base up. And you have to do that. I mean, that's really the goal of the company. But I think sometimes people don't realize that, it gets to the point where you can't manage it anymore with your infrastructure. And one of the images that I was going to put on the slides that I didn't, but it's one that comes to mind all the time. If anybody on the line, I used to watch I Love Lucy reruns. I will specify it was reruns when I was a kid. And one of my favorite episodes was when Lucy and Ethel worked at the candy factory. And the chocolate comes out slowly. It's a conveyor belt, and their job is to wrap the chocolate, essentially, in paper. So it starts coming out slowly, and then the conveyor, and they're able to manage it. And then the conveyor speeds up, and finally it gets to the point where they're shoving chocolate in their mouths. They're stuffing it down their dress. They cannot keep up with it. And I feel like in a lot of cases that's what the software as a service companies reach this point where they grow to such a degree, but they don't put, whether it be policies or controls in place to figure out how do we manage the fact that, we may have a customer that's consuming X in terms of our cloud resources, consuming this much storage, and a customer that's consuming this much storage, and they're paying exactly the same. Our costs for that customer are different, but they're paying the same thing. Our pricing model might not need to change necessarily, but it doesn't seem fair that you've got one customer that's consuming a lot of resources and another customer that's not consuming very many resources, as one example. So I think it's maybe not thinking ahead enough, thinking far enough down the road to what happens. Let's think of your upside scenario, and what does that mean for how you've got to support this in your operations, and kind of running through some of those scenarios. And it might seem I know some people might be superstitious and not want to run through my best case scenario. I'm just launching this business and all I'm focused on is getting that monthly recurring revenue data up. But what happens is you reach a point in time where it's just really hard to stop things and go back in time and fix something. And so you end up having to do a lot on the fly to make it work, and so I think it's just being more proactive. If you're already in that situation, don't think that it's something that you can handle on your own. That's another piece as well. I've worked with so many software companies over the years that have thought, well, I'll just build this capability. I'm a software, I've got these engineers, why don't we just build it? It's not worth your time because there are other companies that have packaged components that do that, and the fact is it has to change over time, likely, so it's not something that you can just engineer once and then, oh great, we've got it, because next year you might be needing to look at something different. So resist the temptation to do it yourself as well is the other thing that I've seen people go through it and wish that they hadn't done that.
Amy, this is Jake. Just to jump in with something to add there, I just before this call, I was actually on the phone with a customer and for Sentinel Cloud, and their reason for going down this path with Sentinel Cloud was really because their traditional on-premise business been around for over a decade, and they now offer SaaS, have been so for the last 2 years, and new sales at this point for SaaS outrun the on-premise. And in that same time period, because of that manual environment that they're in, their support costs, the calls into help desk for some of the manual licensing related stuff related to their service, not to mention the lack of controls, really is eating them alive. So don't wait too long, I guess, is the message there.
Great, thanks, Jake. I don't know, Amy, if you had anything to add to that.
Nope.
Perfect. I think the next question actually goes back to you, Jake. It says that Amy mentioned usage-based billing models. And the question was if you saw this with Sentinel Cloud customers and prospects as well, trending in that direction.
Yeah, definitely. We're seeing usage-based in a couple different ways. In metrics, so things like bandwidth or storage, and we're also seeing usage-based in terms of completing some function or task or initiating a function or task. So we're seeing usage on a couple different levels, but definitely a really big demand area. And actually, interestingly, not just for the SaaS-based. In our on-premise customers are reaching out to us looking to leverage Sentinel Cloud to get that usage capability and adopt those new models as a way to help them start that transition. So we're seeing it across the board.
Great. So Amy, I think the next question is to you. There was a question as to whether or not you saw any particular monetization trends related to the community SaaS offerings.
So I'm going to interpret that the way, so community to community, the way that I think of that is social applications, so community building applications. That might not be the way that the person had thought about that necessarily, but I would point back to the Radian 6 model and trying to measure in some way the liveliness of a conversation. I think that the fundamental kind of rules of pricing and licensing, they don't need to. There's some basics. You might look at the breadth of usage and the volume of usage as being two things to think about, and maybe transactions are another element, but they could fit into any one of those categories. So what's the size of the community? That might be a characteristic of the pricing. How active is the community? That might be a characteristic of the pricing. And then what's the community doing? There might be some sort of a transaction. So if the community is sharing documents, or the community is setting up events, maybe there's some model that makes sense that would measure that amount of activity, and then maybe there's some sort of an outcome. And I'm not saying that the pricing model should include all of these elements, because that probably would not be too simple. Maybe two of these elements that make the most sense. Maybe there's an outcome. How many successful maybe it's two communities and they're recruiting, how many successful job candidates hired or something like that. I think that there are some basic elements that apply in pricing, and I think that the great thing about software as a service applications is you do have that central place that you're managing the software. So there is the ability to do that metering and tracking centrally for some of these different business outcomes. It just might not be inherent in the platform today.
Great, thanks, Amy. So the next question, I think both Amy and Jake could take a stab at. Maybe we'll start with Jake. There was a question as to whether or not you could provide an example of someone or a company doing value-based pricing, for example, by revenue per project or per employee work hour.
That's interesting. I'm trying to think. I have one customer in mind right now who is essentially, they provide optimization solutions for their customers, and as a result can measure quite well the financial gain or benefit or cost savings to the customer. So we're kind of seeing a RevShare Model or a percent of savings model that's coming out of their capabilities. So really delivering a return to the ISV based on the value that they're delivering to their customers. So that's probably the best example I have on top of mind.
Yeah, I mean, I would point back to the Radian 6 example mainly because they were part of this presentation and a case study that I did recently, and you know that was really an outcome based on the liveliness of the conversation. It's not a business outcome like revenue. I think revenue is a really tricky one because there are so many elements that might go into revenue that are independent from the application. So that is one that over the years, and I've certainly seen pricing models that are based on some sort of a revenue component, there's usually a lot of pushback or they can be somewhat contentious because of customer concerns that there are so many outside things that contribute to revenue as an example. I think something like per project or per employee work hour where you can isolate the value of the application in a way that makes sense to the customer and to you. You know, those can be successful approaches as well, and we've seen examples of those. But I think the revenue one in particular can be a tricky one unless your application, the value can be very, very clearly isolated there.
Yeah, it's a tough model, especially when the customer's perception of the value is hard to measure. So
another one that's tough is margin, so price based on a portion of margin for the exact same reason. We've seen it in the retail space, a few applications, and there's just a lot of pushback in some cases because the margins are so thin and they don't want to give up a component of that, and in other cases because there are so many other components that go into margin that it's hard to isolate the application.
Great, thanks guys. So I think we have, I'm going to go with, there's 2 more questions that came in and then we'll wrap up and we will answer all the other questions via Twitter and we'll add it to the comment section of the slides when we post them to SlideShare. So the first one is for Jake. Jake, there was just a request from the audience to confirm whether or not Sentinel Cloud was offered as a service or as an application that needed to be installed and managed locally.
Yep, Sentinel Cloud is delivered over the cloud. It's a service-based offering.
Perfect. And then Amy, the last question I'll throw over to you, and Jake, if you want to add anything to it, please feel free. The question was, with regards to, I guess, go-to-market timing for cloud services in the software industry, is it still early, or do we still have lots of time? In other words, is it still okay that I don't have a cloud or SaaS solution on my roadmap yet, or have we missed the boat?
Well, I think, you know, and as somebody who's been looking at this space now for a decade or so, there really aren't any categories of applications that have not been touched by cloud. You know, it used to be that we would say, well, supply chain management applications, they're so heavily customized, or analytics, that was one area that took a while for cloud to really penetrate there, software as a service, because of the integration issues. But there's no area that's untouched by cloud today. However, adoption is different in different categories. So, for example, if you have a CRM solution and you don't have a cloud play, well, yeah, you definitely missed the boat on that. You know, if you've got an engineering application, you know, maybe a manufacturing supply chain application, something that's a bit more customized, and maybe a bit more technical level of user, then maybe it's okay that you don't have a cloud play today. But I think that you certainly should be looking at it, you know, in terms of your roadmap, because you likely have competitors that are offering that way, and I would expect you have customers that are saying, what is your play for cloud, or how can you help me get to cloud? So you need to be able to have a coherent message around that, and even if it's not, you know, we are going to offer a public cloud service, you're going to be in someone's private cloud. Your application is probably going to exist in one of those environments. So if you've got an on-premise perpetually licensed application that's priced per CPU and you don't have a play for what happens if my application's in a virtualized environment, such as a private cloud, you're probably feeling some pain already. So I think it needs to be on the roadmap, or if not, you need to have a good reason why.